Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So let's start off with what's a biodiesel car. In general, a biodiesel fuel vehicle is a vehicle that uses renewable fuel sources such as vegetable oil and animal fats to run and power a diesel engine. Let's move on to the first advantage. There's a radical decrease in the amount of greenhouse gases emitted. Let's take this quote from CSIRO. Palm oil can produce up to an 80% savings in emissions of carbon dioxide. A very interesting argument brought up by Energy Future Coalition of the United Nations Foundation. It presents the fact that the CO2 emitted by burning crops is merely the CO2 that was trapped in the crops. So there's only recycling of the CO2. Well, if you actually burn fossil fuels, which is done in electric cars, you're actually adding CO2 into the atmosphere, which is hidden underground. You're increasing the greenhouse gas effect. Moving on to another advantage is that it's very easy to implement on our current vehicles. No modification is needed to be done. Also, biodiesel fuel acts as a lubricant for your engine, thus it helps it last longer. Thus it's all advantages for you. Another advantage is that it helps developing countries sell their crops. What happens is that when there's a larger demand for crops, the demand curve shifts to the right, and thus the price and the quantity demanded increases. This will allow the developing countries to increase their supply by shifting their supply curve to the right. Thus, it's all advantages because the price will decrease, and the quantity demanded and supplied will increase too. Thus, it's advantages for both the developing and developed countries. Yay, benefits all around. Alright, moving on, it's renewable. Unlike electric cars which use fossil fuels to produce the electricity in the first place, biodiesel engines actually use crops and they're renewable. Also, electric cars use lithium and zinc, which need to be mined. Mining means that it's not renewable. It's going to run out in the future. Thus, it's leading us nowhere. The last but not least, before I move on to Iran, is that biodiesel can be produced from many different crops. Thus, there's less dependence on the type of crop and less dependence on the fuel. Thus, any country can be able to produce its own energy and be sustainable. No need to be dependent on countries and imply quotas and embargoes, which is happening in the current world.
Okay, so I'm gonna keep talking in the same ideas. So for people to start using the biodiesel, it has to be convenient. And for convenience, well, right now we live in the ADD era where everything has to be done fast and well, it has to be quick and dirty for you to do it, or else, well, for electric cars, when you recharge your cars, it's going to have to be done overnight. And if you say you're going on a road trip, or I know you're driving to work or something like that, and you run out of power, you're going to have to refuel quickly. And you don't have time to plug in your car and recharge, but for the biodiesel, you can just refuel normally like you do today. It will still provide you the power you need. Also, it provides jobs because when you produce electricity, that's all done by machinery, but if you have the crops that you need to provide to run the biodiesel, then you need people to harvest all of this and then convert it to usable materials. So that's how you create jobs and you decrease their unemployment. Also, as far as manufacturing goes, it's really the idea of fossil fuels versus food for energy. As long as there's people on this planet, there's going to be land to harvest and to grow food, and so there's always going to be a source of materials for biodiesel. Right now, for example, there's a country in Africa called Sudan that, well, its land is unused yet, but if used, it can feed the entire Arab countries with excess. So just one country used effectively can provide food for, I don't know, 22 others. So that's how efficient we can be in terms of use of land. So there's really no worry when it comes to, well, we're using food, so that's not good for us. Yeah, that's
another point that you can make is that electric cars are, if you ever drive, I don't know who's driven an electric car, but there's a huge lack of power when it comes to your engines. Your engines are not able to produce as much power as when there is fossil fuels or biodiesel at that. So biodiesel provides that extra power that you might need. Now you might say that during the city time you don't really need that power. Well, when you have trucks and everything, because we're talking about renewing every type of vehicle that there is, well, you're not going to be able to do that. So there's going to be some dependency on fossil fuels afterwards.
Also, we would like to stress on the fact that the producers of electric cars are trying to fool the mind of the consumers by letting them think that it's a renewable energy source. But actually, the power plants are producing the electricity from fossil fuels. Thus, it's the same thing. It's not really getting us forward. So, thank you.
Like this? When we look at this debate, we have to ultimately define it as a replacement to petroleum, whether you want biodiesel or whether you want electric cars. And ultimately, for several very important reasons, electric cars present a much better alternative than biodiesel to petroleum. One of the key reasons is that biodiesel has a large amount of emissions when it is used in a car. They may mention, and as they did, that the plants are a CO2 sink and ultimately negate some of this. However, that's not necessarily true. If those plants were not used to make biodiesel, they'd be used as food, and the emissions from a biodiesel car would not have occurred. Meanwhile, an electric car, when in use, has zero emissions. And as electric grids get progressively greener, the emissions overall from an electric car will continue to decrease. Not so with a biodiesel engine, which will have the same amount of emissions regardless of how green the power grid is, and will ultimately serve as a poor replacement to petroleum, because it still does contribute to climate change through the emission of greenhouse gases. Furthermore, there's a key negative effect on consumers that biodiesel has, even if they don't use biodiesel cars. It drives up food prices. So regardless of whether or not you have a biodiesel car, consumers will see a negative impact from biodiesel. Not so with electric, which doesn't have quite the negative impact on food. And in fact, you can use a windmill within a farm area to produce electricity for an electric car. Another key point is energy inefficiency. There's a clear inefficiency being had planting crops, transporting those crops to be refined, transporting those crops again to vehicles. That simply is avoided with electrical cars. In fact, an electrical car is one of the most efficient vehicles per kilometer in terms of energy, whereas biodiesel does not share that same efficiency. There's another important point. There's a finite supply of usable farmland. And if you're using that farmland for crops that are being used in biodiesel, you're ultimately depriving people of a food source, whether or not you say so. Whereas, again, electrical does not have that disadvantage. When we're speaking of electrical cars, we're talking about a true alternative to petroleum. An electric car can be entirely electric-based, it can be a hybrid, thus bridging the gap, thus making a transition. Whereas a biodiesel car is rated at a 5% mixture maximum by several manufacturers. That means more than 5% is not rated by the manufacturer to be used in that car. Again, not the case with electrical, which can have a car that is entirely electric. For these reasons, biodiesel carries some clear negative impacts that make it a poor choice as a replacement to petroleum, and a poor choice for future car manufacture. Meanwhile, electric cars represent a clear alternative, because there is a transition that can be made through hybrids, and a transition further into fully electric cars. Something that isn't necessarily the case with biodiesel, which, when they are used, are often used with fossil fuels in very high mixtures, such as 90%. Now, let's imagine for a moment that the biodiesel industry was allowed to expand. Very illogical moment, but let's imagine. Eventually, they're going to hit a wall where they can't mix anymore with petroleum. And at this point, their expansion is going to be limited. The same thing happened to ethanol in the United States, and the same thing won't happen to electric cars, because cars can be made fully electric. Allow me to pass over to my colleague for some further points.
Let me talk about some of the other advantages of electric cars. Well, for starters, electricity is cheaper than fuel per kilowatt hour. In simple terms, with an electric car, you pay 3 cents a mile, whereas for a fuel car, you pay 16 cents a mile. Let's talk about the convenience with electric cars. The convenience of charging at home rather than going to the gas stations. Think about it. With a fuel car, you go to a gas station, you wait in line, you waste gas to go to the fuel station. With electric cars, you don't need to do that. You can charge it overnight at home. Furthermore, with fuel cars, a person normally waits for the fuel to end before he fills it again. With electric cars, you don't need that. You can charge your car whenever you want. Furthermore, there are 3-minute charging stations that have also been developed if you do not want to charge at home. Other advantages are lower maintenance costs and lesser noise pollution. Another advantage of electric cars is that there will be lesser airborne particulate matter, which means fewer respiratory problems and clearer skies. When you think of the future, think electric car.